Hello, so here I am to read the second part of the chapter which is entitled Merlina. Uh, Before that, let me just remind you that the village I'm saying we lived in is called Potato, and that when we often went for walks with Merlina amongst the trees or amongst disused fields and farming land, if we saw people, they'd often be startled at Merlina's appearance. So here I continue with the second part of Merlina. Merlina's ability to generate conversation extended outside her circle of fellow potatoes. Following her often frightening behaviour towards strangers who dared to wander, run, or cycle along her paths, and after the ensuing apologies and assurances of Stephen and me that Ella now moored, despite the show of teeth and rumbles deep in her chest, it was usual for a little conversation to follow. The dog did not often walk on a lead, but when the circumstances called for it, she was generally quite happy to do so, seeing it as a sign that she was wanted and would be protected. Nevertheless, on the rare occasions when a friendly hand was extended towards her, she darted away, and either Stephen or I would explain how Merlina had become part of our family, and the belief that her encounters with people in the past were likely to have been less than amicable. The result of seeing people regularly helped us become known, and even if those we met knew little about us, they, along with our near and far neighbours, quickly learned who we were, and that we were, most definitely, a couple of potatoes. Nobody mentioned our relationship, but when I was out with Merlina, or when it was just Stephen who popped into town in the car, it became usual for us to be asked, "Onde está seu companheiro?" clearly demonstrating that they saw both of us very much as two halves of a couple. Shortly after Merlina had become part of our funny family, wishing to be responsible pet owners and to ward off future problems and expense, we had inquired about the procedure and cost of getting the dog spayed. We understood that the operation was tied up with registering the animal and obtaining a licence, and this in turn meant that general vaccinations along with a rabies jab would be needed. Unfortunately, squeezed finances meant that we had been in no position to proceed, and the idea had been put on hold, resurfacing once more when we had taken Muffin to the vets. It was at that time that our cat was being treated by the veterinary clinic that we came across information referring to financial assistance with sterilising rescued street dogs. The information about the organisation had been displayed in the waiting room of the vets, and though it was not clear whether or not we would be eligible for a subsidy of the operation, we copied down the email address and made contact. The inquiry prompted a reply that asked us some basic questions, nothing very intrusive. And after the replies had satisfied the charity that they could offer financial assistance, the sterilisation was carried out. It was good business for the vet to strike while the iron was hot. But when they offered to fit the dog in during the following week for further vaccinations and to begin the registration process, we had to explain quite unashamedly that funds were not available, and that in our opinion, enough had already been done for the animal that, but for our charity, would likely not have survived anyway. Steve and I fully believed that we were not being negligent in any way with our decision concerning Merlina, especially as an incident the previous year had taught us about the responsibilities involved when caring for something that relied on us. But we had further lessons to learn. The summer had begun drawing to an end in its usual manner, After months with very little rain, irrigation channels were dry and dusty shades of green remained aplenty on the landscape, broken by the colour of dark purple grapes which clung to the vines during the last days before the Vindima. These sentinels reddened in open countryside and formed barriers around fields which still had remnants of the ripening tomato harvest. While on mountain slopes, the evergreen eucalyptus and pine provided cool shade for the earth beneath them, but could not achieve so much and failed to prevent the ground resembling a grey powder. As the season came to an end, wildlife that usually stayed away from the houses and people began to appear near the villages in search of water. One day, I was out walking with Merlina, and we had followed one of the paths that quite quickly took us to the road some metres above where we lived. The dog at that time, into her second year living with us, was taking a great interest in the long grass verge beside the tarmac road. I was listening for approaching traffic and scanning the road ahead when I heard my walking companion yelp, and within a second my eyes were on her, just in time to see a snake about 1 metre long move away from the dog and disappear into the reeds and grasses. Initially, the yelp had appeared one of surprise rather than injury, because Merlina trotted ahead unperturbed. But then signs started to appear to suggest otherwise. I was usually the one who was trailing, Merlina being the one who was leading. But this changed as her pace became slower and slower, so much so that within a little time she was trailing behind me. Only a few metres further along the track, and she stopped altogether, unable to come to me when I called her. I walked back to my friend, and when I reached her, I noticed how swollen and her nose was and how shallow her breathing had become. There was no other choice but to carry Merlina home, and in my subconscious it registered that at least we were now heading downhill. During the walk, I spoke to Merlina. Tudo bem, Miles? Vamos estar em casa no momento. O capitão vai ajudar. Merlina did not move, and the words of comfort bestowing the virtues of reaching home and Stephen being able to help her make everything all right were for me rather than the dog. But we reached both within a little time, and I called out to my husband. By this time, the 2 small puncture marks were visible on the dog's snout, a couple of centimetres above her nose. "What's happened?" said Stephen. As I recounted the story and continued to hold Merlina on my lap, sitting just outside the kitchen under the veranda, Stephen prepared some warm, salty water. And when that was ready, he bathed the dog's snout, using cotton wool to swab the bite. The swelling continued and started spreading to the animal's neck, making breathing still more laboured. And at that point, Stephen made a decision. We're taking Merlina to the vets. It was the first actual confirmed case of a dog being bitten by a snake that the vet had seen in almost 20 years of practising. She had encountered suspected cases in the past, when owners had taken pets with respiratory difficulties into the surgery, but without no eyewitness accounts and no visible puncture marks, it could just as likely have been a sting which had caused similar signs in those animals to what Merlina was experiencing then. Without a previous solid case to which the vet could refer, she explained that she would administer a level of medication similar to what had given positive results in the past. But she would issue 3 additional syringes for Stephen and me to take with us, which could be used to help the dog throughout the night and the following morning if needed. The details of a veterinary clinic which provided emergency care outside regular treatment hours was also given to us, before we set off home, with Merlina breathing a little more easily. Where I sat in that chapel in England, it was not only the miles which separated me from where I had been that evening a couple of years earlier. It had taken some time, but the snake bite had helped Stephen and me realise that when we had found the little puppy, it was not only Merlina who was the lucky one. From when she had stumbled towards us that late October morning until the time we had taken her home following the visit to the vets with that snake bite, we had been unaware of how much her affections for the sometimes wayward dog had grown. However, whilst monitoring Merlina during those decisive life or death hours, that changed. It was definitely months, not weeks, until the dog started sleeping in the house instead of in the cold concrete building where the cats were also put over night time. Whether or not those months had stretched into a year was impossible to say right then. But what Stephen and I had both realised while Merlina was recovering from the snake ordeal was that she had become a very important part of our funny family. And a little more of the money that was put aside for a rainy day went on the dog's vaccinations and registration, not a penny of which would ever be regretted. Okay, well, tomorrow's chapter 7, is called The Strange Looking Chick. So, Ataya Menya.